The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
It's been a while since we talked about mercenary groups like Blackwater, which were used in the war in Iraq quite a bit. But we have big news from earlier this week when a federal judge sentenced a former Blackwater worldwide security guard to life in prison and sentenced 3 others to 30-year terms for killing 14 unarmed civilians in a Baghdad traffic circle in 2007. This was U.S. District Judge Royce Lamberth, who says that a claim of innocence by Nicholas Slatton, 31 years old, of Tennessee, is to be rejected. He received a life sentence after being convicted of murder in October for firing what prosecutors said were the first shots in a civilian massacre. There were 3 others involved here: Paul Slough, 35 years old, Evan Liberty, 32 years old, and Dustin Hurd, 33 years old, who were sentenced to 30 years plus 1 day in prison after being convicted of multiple counts of manslaughter and attempted manslaughter. The 1 day thing, my understanding is that it's a sentencing thing, that if you're sentenced to 30 years, you're up for parole after 10. But if it's any more than 30 years, you're not up for parole until 20 years. So I believe, Lewis, I could be wrong, that that's the significance of a 30-year plus 1 day sentence.
Okay. Yeah, I was unaware of that, but sounds good.
Every single one of the defendants has vowed to appeal what one of them called a, quote, perversion of justice, saying they were acting in self-defense, in a war zone, in a dangerous place. However, the judge does not agree. It is clear that these fine young men just panicked. The overall wild thing that went on here can just not be condoned by a court. A court must recognize the severity of the crimes committed, including the number of victims. I understand. I'm on board with him saying that this can't go unpunished. I just don't know what he means by saying, I'm sure these were just fine young men. What does he mean? Everybody has bad days. Some days you're in a bad mood and you might be rude to a waiter, and some days you murder a bunch of people, but you're a fine young man. I don't understand the point of throwing in, I'm sure these are fine young men.
Well, I think the point is to show that this was perhaps not an intentional massacre, a deliberate massacre, or maybe even not a malicious one. I think that, you are in a war zone and you do panic, but what he's saying is, even if you panic, you must still be held accountable. And this was just too heinous to let him off the hook.
The guards said that they acted in self-defense after they came under fire from AK-47 gunfire. However, this was a 10-week trial, and according to the judge, no witness testified that they saw any guards come under fire, nor was there even evidence that suggested there were AK-47 rifles carried by Iraqi insurgents in that area at that time. So I think that there's a lot of evidence presented in the case which suggests that fine young men or not, panic or not, there has to be serious punishment here given the number of people that were killed. This was not a license to kill, which, as we've talked about mercenary groups a lot, Lewis. There was this license to kill mentality. We're here with guns and we're not part of the military and we can kind of do whatever we want. And this case, at least, which may be a precedent-setting case, says, no, you cannot do whatever you want.
Think about all the cases that we didn't hear about, or there were no cases, the incidents that we didn't hear about, where some Blackwater mercenaries or other mercenary outfits killed 1 civilian, 2 civilians, maybe 3.
Right.
That probably happened hundreds of times. But this was the big one. And look how long it took for this to happen.
We talked to you last week about a Texas bill which wanted to make it more difficult to film police, making it an actual crime to film police from fewer than 25 feet away. We then had the video released of the South Carolina police shooting that left 50-year-old Walter Scott dead after being shot 8 times in the back from 15 to 20 feet away by Officer Michael Slager. And now that Texas bill, which would have limited police filming, has met its demise. State Rep Jason Villalba from Dallas confirmed he is not going to proceed with seeking a public hearing for the bill, which would have made it illegal to film police within 25 feet of the police activity. Those carrying handguns would have been forced to be 100 feet away from police. The bill contained an exception for news media. This is a good decision, and the individual Villalba who had the idea for the bill said, "Hey, listen, this is I'm a friend of law enforcement. The bill is well intended. I don't mean anything by the bill. This is a good thing." And now saying we're not going to push it. It's abundantly clear that there is no public desire for this. His office was flooded with phone calls and emails. He actually had to tell his staff, let's just work from home. You can ignore the calls, because it was a flood of hate about this bill. Absolutely the right decision. We already have laws in place, as I said, that ensure that you can't do anything, filming or whatever else, if you're interfering with the police investigation. So you don't need an additional law saying that to film you have to be 25 feet away.
This is one of those things that came because they panicked, right? They saw what was happening in different parts of the country, and they're trying to avoid PR nightmares in different situations. And so they decided this bill was a good idea. Well, the bill was a PR nightmare, and it was pretty foolish to think that that it had a chance.
And Villalba said that he's not stopping the progress on the bill, the attempts at progress on the bill, because of the outcry regarding what happened with Walter Scott in South Carolina. He's just saying there was general swift opposition to the bill. It included far left civil libertarians and far right people who say we're limiting the First Amendment. I think the public has spoken very loudly. No controversy for me. Filming police in public is and should be legal, period. No question about it. But whether you're filming or not, you can't act in a way that interferes with or puts people in danger.
That's exactly it. And most of the time people aren't, when you get right in there in a dangerous situation, yeah, I can see that being a problem. But I think police need to get used to this.
Do you film police ever, Lewis? I sometimes will be walking around New York City and I'll see a situation where I say, oh, this might develop into something. If I stay and take out my camera, I might be able to capture some kind of interesting thing that is involving police here. But usually I'm in a rush and I just go wherever I'm going.
Well, really, the only time that I would have that opportunity is when I'm working at the bar downtown, and I don't keep my phone on me because we're not supposed to, and I'd probably start playing Scrabble on it. So I don't keep it on me, but that's when I see all the altercations and the police stops. So, I think if I were out and about and had my phone on me and I saw something that looked like it could get bad, I probably would.
A 65-year-old German school teacher is already a busy mother, has 13 children, and she's reportedly pregnant with quadruplets, Lewis. This is Annegret Raunigk, whose oldest child is 44. She told the German newspaper Bild a few days ago that she's in her 21st week of pregnancy with quadruplets. She is a Berlin native. She says that the pregnancy is the result of artificial insemination using both donated sperm and donated eggs. The pregnancy is being documented for a German TV show. She says that the doctor suggested, you were trying to have one kid, you have quadruplets now. We might want to do like a selective early abortion to reduce the number of kids that you're going to birth. After all, you're 65. And she said she didn't want to do that. And she is already kind of well known for having children. Back in when she was 55 years old, she gave birth to her 13th child. And apparently that daughter, Layla, wanted a little sibling. And that's what led the woman to again try to have children. She's already a grandmother to 7. And as I mentioned, a mother to 13, and potentially will be a mother to 17 different kids.
It's disturbing. I hear a story like this when someone has this many children. It just irks me. I don't know what it is. I mean, is it? I feel like there could be mental illness at play here.
Why do you say that, though? Why not just say, hey, I want to procreate? Well,
I think that it's somewhat normal to want to procreate, but this is just such an extreme example. This is not normal. I just don't get it. Tell me what I'm missing here.
Well, maybe you're not missing anything. Maybe it's just, hey, it's a woman who wants 17 kids, and at 65, although it's a higher risk pregnancy, if she's able to do it, she's doing it.
But think about this. At 65 years old, how long is she going to be around for those children?
So I told a couple people about this, and they said the same thing. Isn't this a little bit not great for the kids, because how long will they have their parents versus a parent who has a child at 30, 35, 40, 45, or even 50 because she's 65. So you think that that's sort of a consideration?
And yes, and the more children you have, I mean, how much attention and love can you give to each individual child simultaneously? I think that this seems to me like a very selfish act.
Is there anything appealing to you, Lewis, about having, a ton of kids and grandkids running around as you get older? I'm not saying 17 children, but just, a whole bunch.
A whole bunch? No, that sounds terrible. I think maybe a couple would be somewhat doable.
Really? So, Lewis, I think you're slightly changing your tune on this compared to the days of, listen, I don't want kids. If I accidentally had a kid, I'd probably love the kid.
No, I'm not seeking it out, and I'm not going to. But if it happened, I mean, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. But do I want 10, 12 children and grandchildren running around my place? No, that's a nightmare.
But let me ask it in a different way. If today, at age 30, you think of your life at age 50, does that picture include one or two children that are somewhere in the world?
No.
Really?
No, it doesn't. Now, when I envision that, no, it does not.
Wow. What does it include then? I'm wondering. It might be shocking to the audience.
Me enjoying myself and doing whatever I want, whenever I want.
So at this point, you're still feeling like you don't want children?
Yes.
I'm still in the I don't know camp, and it's where I'm at. I'm 31, and I'm in the camp of, it's hard for me to really think about this year or next year or even the year after saying I'm going to now change what my lifestyle is to one that includes children, right? The logistics of that don't seem particularly appealing, and that doesn't seem like my thing necessarily. At the same time, though, when I think about the idea of being 40 or 50 and not having any children, that also doesn't seem appealing to me. So I think that I'm kind of in the mindset where the idea of it seems like something that I would be interested in, but I don't really see myself being like, okay, next year I'm looking to have a kid.
Well, I think there are some nice alternatives. Like, for example, when you are 50, you could adopt like a 15-year-old and, skip all the difficult stuff. Then you've got your kid.
Is that something you would think about doing?
Probably not, but
Okay.
It's an option that's out there.
All right. So the continued. Oh, and where are you on marriage? We should just check in about that.
Marriage is fine.
Marriage is fine. Okay, very good. All right, so that's the latest update from Lewis, and I guess from me as well. Very, very interesting. We will, hopefully everything goes well with this woman's pregnancy, regardless of whatever we may think about her mental state and the potential selfishness of what she's doing. Obviously, we hope for the health of the mom and the children. Let's take a break. What a program we have for you today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Our program is funded by the audience through the membership program. Today's new member of the day is Timothy Shute. You can sign up as a member at davidpakman.com/membership. This week in show history, 6 years ago this week, Texas Congresswoman Betty Brown asked the Asian community to change their names so that they would be easier for Americans to deal with, or maybe just so she didn't sound so dumb trying to pronounce them. After Democrats pointed out that this is actually quite racist and xenophobic, she said that it's Democrats who are really the guilty ones because they're making it about race. Ultimately, she did issue an apology. This is not really a new mentality to the U.S. It started at Ellis Island. People would come in with a last name where they would say, oh, here's my last name. The person recording their last name wouldn't understand that. They wouldn't care to understand it. They say, hey, here's your new name. It's easier to pronounce. It makes more sense. So there's a lot of this. And then even when you look at first names, the children of parents who recently came to the U.S. often will be given very American-sounding names to help them integrate and assimilate. And this has been going on for a long time.
I remember going to a Japanese restaurant back in Western Mass, and it was one of those hibachi places. And we'd sit down, and the chef would come over, and he would say, Asian fellow, very thick accent, and say, "Hi, my name is Bob." And I'm thinking to myself, no, your name is not Bob. Why don't you just tell me your name? I can handle it. I assure you, I can deal with it. But I think that's another example of this. Just using kind of a fake name in a situation like that to make things easier.
Yeah, I've had this happen with YouTube support when they are in other countries. They will say, "Oh, my name is Jim," and you know that it's not. When the IRS scammers call, they often say that their names are also Joe or something like that when it's not. They're in India. With technical support staff in general, that often happens. This is a common thing. And often when I inquire about it, they say, "Oh, that's my Christian name," which also seems like an oddly outdated phrase to say.
Yeah, that's a Christian name. That's interesting. I mean, I'm pretty sure English was not the language of Christianity at its inception,
Right.
conception. So, that's an odd one.
4 years ago this week, Ann Coulter claimed that it was only liberal media who were talking about birther stories minutes before Fox News did a piece on birtherism. And when something absurd like the birther movement comes to fruition, there's a choice that corporate media has to make about how to handle it. You can completely ignore it on the one hand and say this basically doesn't exist, which the White House did for a while until they released President Obama's birth certificate, because just addressing it can be perceived as giving some kind of credibility to it. On the other hand, you can address it and try to dismiss claims or provide counterpoints, but then you could be accused of bad journalism, right? Oh, you're writing this off when it's a real thing. It can be kind of a no-win situation. Ultimately, it seems that the White House did the best they could, which is not address it. At a certain point, say, hey, there's this thing that won't go away. Here's the birth certificate. It's real. And then be done with it. But as we saw, even putting the birth certificate out there, those who really wanted to believe in the conspiracy were not affected by the birth certificate. They just said, oh, it's a fake birth certificate.
No, it seems like you really can't win in a situation like this. Fox News, I think Fox News won. They knew how to win because they understood their viewers. And I think this was probably discussed every day for maybe an entire year on Fox News.
It is also laughable how Ann Coulter tried to say that it was just the only coverage of birther stuff was liberal media trying to make right-wingers look bad by accusing them of being birthers. But obviously it came from right-wingers, and it's just patently absurd that she would try to push it as anything else.
It's like completely ignoring every prominent right-winger who would say something about the birth certificate. How do you write all that off and just blame it on the liberal media?
1 year ago this week, it's been a year since the beginning of the Cliven Bundy ranch debacle in Nevada, a 20-year-old battle, 20-year-long legal battle between the Bureau of Land Management and Cliven Bundy, which just exploded a year ago. Bundy's cattle had been grazing on federal land for many years, and Bundy claimed, hey, this is just my land, and he refused to pay grazing fees, which led the government to prohibit his cattle from feeding there, and ultimately he was told to stop trespassing on that land, and then it turned into a media explosion with armed gunmen. Well, I guess they wouldn't be gunmen if they weren't armed, showing up there, militias, so-called sovereign citizens there to protect his land from the feds, protests, armed confrontations. And it was such a great example of how different the men with guns situations are, depending on whether you're a sort of rural, typically white individual who is arming themselves against the government versus urban, non-white individuals who have weapons. The perception in corporate media was so drastically different.
It was really interesting to watch that whole thing unfold. I think had there been shots fired, it would have obviously been even more interesting. And, I'm glad they weren't. But the media ate this one right up. And in a lot of cases, they did not really make these militiamen out to be violent, malicious people.
Absolutely. These individuals show up in violation of what is the law. You might disagree with the law, but it's still the law. It's still back taxes that are owed. And they show up with guns pointed at representatives of the federal government, and they're portrayed as heroes by the same corporate media that would demonize those who even often just being shot by police gets you demonized by the same right-wing media. And these individuals show up with guns pointed at government agents, and they're the heroes all of a sudden.
And the incredible thing about all of this is that they basically won. The whole thing, the whole thing kind of fizzled, and the Fed said, "Okay, well, we're not done with this. This is an ongoing thing." But at the moment, I don't think he is paying any fines or penalties, and things are just continuing.
It's truly stunning that the entire Cliven Bundy debacle, the right-wing media characters jumping to his defense, the fact that the guy seems to be an unabashed racist. We talked about that. I mean, it's just all completely ludicrous. And it's been a year since that happened, which is quite stunning. Respond to us on any of these stories or others on our Twitter account, twitter.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
As more and more Republicans are announcing their candidacies for 2016 Republican presidential nominee, we have to remember that there is going to be so much flip-flopping and equivocating and non-economic thinking on issues related to employment and the economy that today, for our classic interview, we're going back to October of 2013, where I spoke to Lowell Ponte, the former roving editor for Reader's Digest, and he is a sort of fiscally conservative, and I use that term very loosely, a so-called fiscally conservative guy, and he did not understand even the most fundamental elements about economics. Let's remember this going into the 2016 Republican primary campaigns. Analyze the economic statements based on what we know from past evidence. When you hear that supply-side economics work, remember that there's no evidence that supply-side economic policies work. Let's go back to Lowell Ponte. Brace yourselves for this type of infuriating conversation with so-called fiscal conservatives. I'm joined today by Lowell Ponte, who is the former roving editor for Reader's Digest. He's also author of the new book, The Great Withdrawal: How the Progressives' 100-Year Debasement of America and the Dollar Ends. It's great to have you with us today. I want to talk about your recent editorial, Obamacare May Be Delayed and U.S. Debt Jumps $328 billion in one day. I don't even know where to start because this piece is really chock full of interesting stuff. Let's start with debt and deficit. What is specifically your gripe with President Obama when it comes to debt and deficit?
Well, it's my gripe with progressives in general, and that is, ever since 1913, they have moved to a society in which we run by printing money. And when politicians of whatever party are given a chance to print money and to buy votes with it, they will do so, which I believe to be a destructive thing for the economy in the long run. We now, in fact, have accumulated so much debt, current and projected, that if we had to pay it off today, Dave, you would have to take dollar bills out of your wallet and make a stack of them that would reach from here to the planet Venus, 23 million miles away, and back, and you would still have enough dollars you'd need to pay to make 11 more stacks between Earth and the Moon.
Okay, but to pause there for a second, and rather than focusing on how many stacks of money we would need, let's focus on data and fact, because you said this is your problem with progressives and has been since the early 20th century. However, when we look at the data, and this is a statement which has been evaluated by the nonpartisan group PolitiFact and evaluated as true,
Actually, there's a great argument as to how nonpartisan PolitiFact really is, but go ahead.
Okay, well, let me get the argument out in any case. The deficit, not the total amount of that debt, the deficit has been falling at the fastest rate in 60 years under President Obama. You would have to go back 63 years to the period between 1946 and 1949 to find a bigger 4-year drop than what we saw between 2009 and 2012. So my question is, if your problem is with increasing of the deficit, your problem really should be with George W. Bush, not with President Obama.
Well, as a libertarian, I also do have a problem with George W. Bush and the Republicans.
Good.
I'm not saying this is a Republican or Democrat matter.
Well, but it
I'm
is
saying there's a
because you
tendency by
simply you
politicians
just
to
said
enlarge government, and under President Obama, in fact, the share of government as a part of our gross domestic product has risen from about 19% when he took office to at its peak more than 25%. It's now around 23%.
Okay, so we need to be able
the economy by about 25% in 5 years.
But let's explore that, because your initial argument was that your problem with progressives is how they blow up the debt and deficit. I came back and I said, actually, President Obama has reduced the deficit, not increased it. And then you came back and said, well, it's not so much about Democrats and Republicans, but initially you said it was. Now you're redirecting. This is what's called an ad hoc rescue. You're redirecting and saying, actually, the problem is that President Obama has increased the share of the GDP that comes from the government. We're now no longer talking about the initial issue. These are very common redirection techniques.
Well, this is not intended as a technique. This is, if you ask why has the deficit temporarily come down, and by the way, according to the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, the deficit is going to, after this little dip, resume its stratospheric climb. We, by the year 2016, are going to be $20 trillion in debt.
But hold on, now we're talking about...
Things are being adjusted in part because last January, the Republicans agreed to $600 billion in additional taxes.
So what you're saying is that now you're going back and saying, initially you said it was partisan. Then when I pointed out that actually those numbers favor progressives, you said it's not partisan. And now you're actually saying it is partisan, but it's because of Republicans that the deficit has gone down, but it'll be back up really soon. Is that the argument if I follow it back and forth?
No, I think what you're trying to do is elicit a polarization here where there really isn't one.
No. I'm not trying to elicit a polarization at all. Okay, let's see if we can refocus in a different way, because I think that if the argument changes every time I present a fact, we're not going to get too far.
You keep arguing that what you're speaking of are facts, when in fact they are government massages of the data. But go ahead.
So why would the data only be massaged when President Obama is in office to be favorable to him, yet not when any other president? That doesn't really make sense. Hold on a second, Lowell. But Lowell, you said you based your opinion that since 1913 progressives have been really bad for the debt and deficit, presumably on the same government data that you're now calling that has been massaged. So really, shouldn't we go back and say, actually, you can't even make that claim about progressives because you're basing it on the same data I'm using?
No, I can make that claim about progressives because progressives have been leaders, and they've certainly brought Republicans along with them.
Yeah.
Remember, by the way, the Republicans were the original progressive party here.
But again, Lowell, we're not talking about that. That doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about. Let me put a pause here.
Does.
I don't think we're getting anywhere. Let's talk about the devaluing of currency.
You're trying to do a very narrow focus, and I'm trying to do a broader focus.
Let's broaden the focus. That's what I want to do. One of the other things that you talk about in your piece about the debt jumping.
By the way, what is this piece of mine? I don't remember writing such an article.
This is what your publicist sent me, and it has quotes from you and your co-author, Craig Smith.
But I didn't actually write that. But anyway,
so your publicist is pitching you with quotes that aren't yours?
Oh, they may be, but they're in the publicist's context.
Okay. Let me give you the following statement, which I've been told is from your new book. China has already downgraded the U.S. credit rating, and the talk on the street is Moody's and S&P may drop our credit rating from AAA to A-. This is a frightening prospect for a country that issues the world's reserve currency. I thought that as a libertarian, which you claim to be, you would want China to have less control over the U.S. economy. So wouldn't it be a positive thing if China were less interested in holding our debt such that they would sell it and have less control over the American economy? Wouldn't a libertarian welcome that?
We unfortunately live at a moment where America's number one export is its debt, is selling U.S. treasuries like that to China, Japan, and other nations. I would prefer that we were a country that had sound money, that did not rely on running on debt, as we do now. But we've set ourselves up in a position of having so many obligations and such a diminished productivity here that we apparently have to run the government by stretching out obligation that way.
Okay, so
and
then,
as a libertarian, you're right. I'm appalled by that.
Okay, but so then what is going to be the problem with China with the China downgrade of the U.S. debt? Isn't it just going to relieve us to some extent from Chinese ownership of American debt?
It's going to create a world in which the U.S., of course, is no longer the reserve currency, but this is something we've done to ourselves. China is simply recognizing that our dollar, which is no longer based in anything tangible, we have a faith-based currency now.
Correct.
We basically worldwide are losing faith in the dollar because our Fed, our government, is printing out of thin air $1 trillion a year. Now, there are some things Congress and the president cannot do. They cannot, for example, repeal the law of gravity. I wish they could. I mean, I wouldn't have to diet as much. But they can't. And likewise, they can't repeal the law of supply and demand. Dollars are just a commodity like potatoes when it comes down to it. And if the government out of thin air prints an extra trillion of them a year, then the value of the dollar relative to potatoes and other things falls. So it takes more dollars to buy things. That's the position we've put ourselves in. Meanwhile, we have an economy with only 101 million Americans who have full-time jobs, but we have 108 million Americans who are taking one or another means-tested welfare benefit.
Well, let's pause there.
49.2% of American households where somebody there gets a government check.
Let's pause there. I think you've opened up a topic for a much broader discussion. My counterpoint, and we will leave it at this, is that if your concerns are those jobs and American production, the devaluation of U.S. currency somewhat would increase tourism and it would increase exports from the U.S., which would provide many, many more jobs. But this is getting into more of a monetary policy, fiscal policy discussion, which unfortunately we don't have time for today, but I would love to have you back. Lowell Ponte, it would be a pleasure to have you back again.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's time to answer audience questions. We do this every Friday. Submit your questions at davidpakman.com, on Twitter at David Pakman Show, or leave them as a voicemail, 219-2DavidP. Here is a voicemail question for us. Take a listen.
Yes, this is Troy the Troll York. Is calling for your question for your weekend show. Actually, I was listening to today's show, and you were playing a hatred Bale and George Zimmerman, and you were kind of mocking the people's grammar and their mistakes and the sentence structure. And I was just curious if you ever make any mistakes when you broadcast your little YouTube channel, and or is that edited out?
Right.
Thank you. Have a good day.
All right. So, yes, it is a trolling question from Troy the Troll York, but we will answer it anyway. We have never, Lewis, I can say with certitude, cut out a grammatical mistake that we made on the show. The show is done live to tape, which means we record it as if it were live, and there is no editing done. The exceptions to this rule would be if there's a technical issue, like if during an interview we get disconnected from the guest for 2 minutes. We're going to cut out that 2 minutes of just trying to reconnect with the guest. If we want to play a clip and we simply didn't have it ready when we thought we would, and it took us 45 seconds to get the clip up and running. In the final version of the show, we might remove that 45 seconds just because we don't want to lose 45 seconds of show waiting for a clip to come up. But correct me if I'm wrong, Louis, that's generally the only type of correction that we do.
Yeah, we don't really catch our grammatical errors because, I mean, if we did, we would probably try to correct one another immediately. I mean, they're mistakes, and we're doing the show. We're not paying attention. We don't hear them. Eventually, they go up, and we will get emails from people addressing our mistakes, pointing them out, and then we are embarrassed or whatever.
Yeah,
that's usually how it happens.
Issue a correction or read a funny email about a grammatical mistake or whatever. But no, we don't. If you're not hearing grammatical mistakes, it's not because we're editing them out. It's either because we didn't make them in that particular episode, or because we made them and you maybe didn't realize that it was a grammatical mistake. I don't want to overstep my authority, Louis, but maybe sometimes somebody might not recognize that there was a grammatical mistake made. So the show is done live to tape, and with the exception of technical issues, significant technical issues, you are seeing the show as recorded. Alyssa wrote to me saying, are both of you open to dating interracially? I'll go first. Yes. I mean, this is just a short answer for me. I don't disqualify any potential romantic interest based on race, right? I mean, I might find someone attractive or not, regardless of what race there are. I'm sure based on where one grows up and the sort of demographics of that area, you encounter more or less people from any particular racial or ethnic background. But I don't say, I don't know that many people other than some racists who just say, I would not consider dating a person from this particular race on principle.
Okay, and part two to the question, have you ever dated interracially?
I guess if you consider, here's the thing. This Hispanic thing, right? It keeps going back and forth as far as who is Hispanic. Last week on the show, I said I'm technically Hispanic according to the census. But at the same time, my race is identical as an Eastern European Jew, as a family who came from Eastern Europe to the U.S. Because my family was in Argentina for a few generations, I'm considered Hispanic. And people wrote in and said, David, stop trying to deny that you're Hispanic. I'm not denying it. Growing up, I thought I truly was Hispanic. And then people said to me, David, you're really not Hispanic racially. You're of Hispanic culture. And then others say race is just a construct anyway. So by some definitions of what Hispanic is, then the answer would be yes. I have dated interracially. And others would argue, David, you've dated people who are Eastern European Jews of Hispanic culture. At this point, who really cares?
I guess the same type of logic could be applied to me, right? Seeing as how I am half Middle Eastern, if you consider me to be Middle Eastern, then I suppose, and if that's even different from Caucasian,
right, in
my case, then yes, I have dated interracially. But let's just assume I'm just a good old white boy from the United States of America. The answer would be no, I haven't dated interracially.
Wow.
But I would love to. Yeah, that sounds great because I have not done that.
And I think that there's also another element to this, which is that there's often much more of a cultural divide between people than there is racial, right? I mean, I think if you look at different parts of the country, the parts that are more racially diverse often have fewer differences between people with regard to race, but the more significant differences seem to appear with regard to cultural background and class differences, because the areas that are more diverse racially often are the more cosmopolitan areas where you will often see more diversity in terms of cultural background.
Yeah, definitely. If I were to let's say I were still in Western Massachusetts, and I'm dating a black woman who was also born and raised in Western Massachusetts, I think that would be pretty much night and day from dating some, white woman who was born on the bayou in Mississippi or whatever.
No question about it. Yeah, absolutely. So to answer the question directly, both Louis and I are open to dating interracially. I hope that is a clear and unequivocating answer. Elliot wrote in saying, would you break the law to save a loved one? how would you decide which laws? So we took a similar question a few months ago, which is, would you lie to prevent a loved one? Would you lie under oath to prevent a loved one from going to jail? And we both basically said that it would really depend on the specifics. Is this someone who, in all likelihood, has murdered someone, and we would just have to lie with a fake alibi to try to create a situation where they're found not guilty? Or is it someone who is being targeted by what we find to be an unfair war on drugs, and we could maybe get them out of trouble by telling a white lie? To recap, Lewis, we said it would really depend on the situation, I believe.
We did, yes. I think it would depend on the crime. It would depend on what we would have to do in this case to break the law. What laws would we be breaking? I'll let you start with that.
Yeah, so let's get into this question. Would you break the law to save a loved one? I'm going to assume that this doesn't mean legally save, like save from prosecution. I'm going to say physically save. Someone is in physical danger. Would you break the law to save a loved one? What type of scenarios are we talking about? If I knew that someone was stuck inside a house and there was carbon monoxide filling the house, would I break and enter that house in order to get them out, even though that would be a crime? I probably would, right? Because later I would explain, and you would assume most reasonable individuals would understand what you were doing. And even if they didn't, and I was still accused of breaking and entering a house, that you would, given the circumstances, be able to get a plea or some kind of smaller punishment. So I think in that particular case, sure, I would break the law to save a loved one.
Okay, I have a hypothetical for you then. Let's take it to the next level. Let's say your sister is, it's many years from now, and your sister is in a relationship with someone that is incredibly abusive, physically abusive, verbally abusive, mentally, you name it.
I hate him already. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. She is too terrified to do anything about it, and you think it's getting to the point where she could be killed, and she is too terrified to talk to anyone, to go to the police, to do any of that. Would you kill that man?
I would not kill the man. I would not kill the man. I would certainly, though, get involved, and we talked about this slightly a few months ago in, would you work to break up a relationship that you believe is bad for one or both of the people in it? I would certainly get involved in some way to try to put an end to the abuse. Now, would this be myself trying to work to get evidence of abuse to get this individual arrested? That can be risky because people often get bailed out, and then what if he goes back and he takes it out on my sister? Mm-hmm. I mean, this is a very complex situation. The
police show up and she denies it. The police show up and she tells the police to go away. There's nothing wrong. Do you just break his legs? It's
really hard to say because, what could you do first? Could I set up cameras to try to record the guy abusing her? Well, what's the legality of secretly setting up cameras? That would be breaking the law. But would I be willing to do that? This is tough. And to be quite honest, it's quite flustering to think about this possibility, particularly as she's only a few years away from the age at which she might start to date.
Yeah. I think I would definitely break the law under, probably the majority of situations to save a loved one. But, when it comes to those really extreme examples like murder or, destruction of property valued over a certain amount, or things that would put me in prison for a very long time, I don't know. I think it would depend on the level of danger to them,
If you were a parent, you accidentally have a kid, by chance you happen to love the kid, perfect. I think it's hard for either of us to say because we aren't parents, but from parents I speak to, there are many dads who say, I would go to jail for life if I knew that it meant taking an action that would keep one of my children safe.
Yeah, I think... it's crazy to think about because there are so many situations, there are so many variables, and it's a lot to consider. But I am not above breaking the law when it comes to friends and family.
All right. I think generally I agree with Lewis, although our red line may be different. What about you? Would you break the law to save a loved one? How would you decide which laws? We have a terrific bonus show coming up. There is only one way to get access to the bonus show, and that's by being a David Pakman Show member, which you can sign up for at davidpakman.com/membership.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.